Ladies and gentlemen, before we start this webinar, please make sure your audio volume is properly adjusted. So we know that you can hear us clearly, I can ask you to please click on the hand icon located in the Microsoft Teams control panel. That's perfect, thank you. If you're experiencing any audio difficulties, please refer to the audio settings in your panel. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our ACI World, IATA, and WWACG webinar entitled Aviation Industry Global Approach for Slot Rules in Summer 2020. I'm Kevin Caron, Vice President Global Assessments and Training at ACI World, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's webinar. During the webinar, I'll provide a short introduction, which will be followed by a panel discussion, and we have some very distinguished speakers with us here today. Please note that the recorded version of this webinar will be available on the ACI World and IATA websites in about 24 hours. Before we start, I'd like to remind our speakers and the audience that the discussions will take place in full compliance law requirements or competition law requirements, which will now show on the screen as a reminder of the matters we won't and cannot discuss. If you are submitting a question, please be aware of these guidelines. The Worldwide Airport Slot Board, or WASB, is the forum bringing together representatives from the airport, airline, and slot coordinator community to develop airport slot policy and positions on behalf of the global aviation industry. The WASB has released their approach to gradually reinstate normal airport slot rules, taking into account the continued crisis we're suffering in aviation. This webinar aims to provide an opportunity to understand why the WASB came together to make a recommendation, along with what the proposal means for airport slot coordination and airport slot use in the summer of 2020, and what the regulators are now asked to consider to support the industry's recovery. The discussion will be between representatives from the global airport, airline, and slot coordination communities. And I'm very pleased to have with us today, again, some very distinguished speakers. So Joe Pita, Head of Airline Business at Sao Paulo, Guarulhos International Airport, and Chairperson of the WASB. Irene Garcia, Head of Airport Marketing at IATA. Ricky Christensen, Vice President Networks, Alliances, and Commercial Planning at Virgin Atlantic, and Chairperson of the IATA Slot Policy Working Group. Anthony Chan, Manager Network Planning at Hong Kong Express. Didier Hawk, Managing Director at the Belgian Slot Coordination and Chair, European Airport Slots Coordinators Association. And last but certainly not least, Petra Popovic, Managing Director, Airport Coordination Australia and Chair, Asia Pacific Airport Slot Coordinators Associations. Again, just as a reminder, if you have any questions for the panelists, I do ask you to use the chat box on your screen, and we'll attempt to get through some of those questions at the end of the presentation. Now on to our topic. The Worldwide Airport Slot Board, or WASB, calls for the temporarily adopt more flexible slot rules in line with recommendations in order to preserve essential air transport connectivity. The WASB position recommends the following to be adopted before the end of 2020. Number one, full series of slots returned by carriers before the 8th of February 2021 will receive alleviation. Number two, carriers who pick up these series and operate them on a non-historic basis will receive priority over any new demand for the same timings in the next equivalent season, subject to available capacity. Number three, slots retained after the 8th of February 2021 will be subject to a slot usage requirement threshold of 50-50, recognizing that regulators may review the threshold based on their market situation. The provision for cancellations before the historic baseline date will be temporarily suspended. Number four, specific justified non-utilization of slots, force majeure, provisions for slots canceled due to the government-imposed restrictions resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic that prevent or restrict air travel. And number five, alleviation measures will not apply to slots held by airlines permanently ceasing operations at an airport. There are also conditions attached to the proposal, including that new slots cannot benefit from alleviation and need to be operated in accordance with the lower use threshold for quality historics. Now let's hear the view of some of our distinguished panelists on the WASB recommendations. Irene, I'll start with you. Why is it important to have partial relief for slot use, along with a gradual reinstatement of normal slot policy in S21? From your point of view, what's the outlook for 2021, and how can the recommendations help the IATA network of airports?
Thank you very much. Now it's complicated to have a clear outlook of what will summer 2021 will look like, because the situation is not good for the airports worldwide, and we're suffering the effects of the pandemic and the restrictions. But I think that we hope that there will be some kind of recovery, although not evenly in all the markets. So I think two of the objectives of this proposal, this agreement, tries to tackle those issues. So on one hand, we would like to preserve connectivity and route networks, like you mentioned, and so the full series alleviation will allow this, since not all the markets will recover at the same rhythm, and therefore there will be available capacity when those markets are fully at full speed. And on the other hand, it does establish a procedure whereby we start having an outlook of our recovery, a new normal post-COVID, with the reinstatement of the 80-20 rule. The recommendation establishes the 50-50 threshold, as you mentioned, which can be adapted in each market according to the specific circumstances. And what this means is that slots that are mainly not operated will be lost and will be reallocated. So it again brings the path to normality.
Yeah, path to normality. I know we're all eagerly waiting for. So thanks very much for that. Anthony, we'll move over to you. Sort of perspective from an airline. Can you explain the main elements of this package and I guess what it means for the airlines, low-cost carrier and legacy carriers alike?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Irene has said, and I think the essence of the package is that it allows us airlines a chance to preserve our network and also our bank structure by returning full series of slots. And because if you look at all the industry data that is available to us right now, recovery actually varies quite a bit in terms of whether we are looking at domestic or international services, long haul or short haul flights, cargo or passenger service, or even by region. So where I'm from, as an example, in Asia, if we look at international traffic, we're actually still quite a bit behind compared to, say, for example, Europe. And then within Asia, we have places where I am in Hong Kong and also Singapore, where there's no domestic flights at all to fall back on. So we kind of expect even slower recovery here. And I think it really shows in our forward booking trends that we can see every day. So when I look at my reports for April, May and June, the bookings are actually quite far behind on where they need to be. And that's because people simply aren't booking, even on SLCCs. And I think regulators need to understand that bookings aren't coming in now, and they won't suddenly flood in when things improve. So a slot usage threshold reduction on its own isn't going to help the industry or consumers. And I think we really can't afford to put any specific type of traffic or a specific region at a disadvantage when it comes to slot policies, because ultimately consumers will lose out on connectivity if we allow that to happen. And if you look at the full service carrier spectrum of the industry, airlines cannot afford to operate ghost flights that are 13, 14 hours long just for the preservation of slots, because of all the extra fuel burn and all the productivity costs that all these long haul flights are associated with. So I think in such a case, long haul intercontinental flights will disappear first. And I guess what I really want to say is we need to implement this package as a whole in its entirety in order to help prevent the potential deglobalization of our industry.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Anthony. And yeah, again, a lot of challenges and curveballs thrown our way throughout the pandemic, and getting out of it is not going to be a one-size-fits-all, as you well put out. Didier, maybe moving to you. Understanding slot coordinators need to work with packages, this package of measures. What would be some of the key differences to the normal approach, I guess, to put it in simple terms?
Thank you. Not surprisingly, I will repeat a bit what my colleagues just said before me. One of the most important parts here is the window that will be open between the 1st and the 8th of February for airlines to return full series for which they are looking for full alleviation. In comparison with usual rules, it will encourage a return of full series at a significant earlier point in time. And it will make a significant number of slots available for mobility, not especially for new series, because we do not expect so many new programs, but also and mainly for improvement of the slots that are on the wait list. It's one essential point also for airports, because it will give them a clear view on the program of the summer 21 at an earlier stage. Than what we have now for the winter 20, or the people can wait until 3 weeks before the date of operation before they return their slots eventually. So the gap, the time to anticipate the changes of the traffic will be increased for all the actors. The second point for me is the threshold at a lower value, because it's another essential point. By lowering the threshold, this recommendation recognizes that that the markets will not be ready to return to their full capacity at the same speed, and at the same time it will also oblige the airlines to work and communicate on plans of operation that are closer to the reality. And at the end of the season, of course, like Irene was saying, a number of slots will be lost and will be put back in the slot pool for a reallocation of the summer 22. So it will create new opportunities. The last but not least, I think the alleviation measure did not apply to airlines that permanently cease their operation at an airport. Yeah, it's important that to force the airlines who do not intend to operate their programs at the airport to return their slots and to have a possibility to take their slots and put them back to the slot pool and to be reallocated in a transparent, independent, and non-discriminatory manner. So I think these are the three most important elements, which are a big difference with the normal procedures. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Didier, and definitely important elements to get us back. Joa, just moving to you now. The Worldwide Airport Slot Board is a newly formed global body, right? So for slot coordination policy and process improvement. From your point of view and from your position, what is the WASB asking regulators to consider? And maybe you could add to that a little bit, why can't the WASB implement this globally? So again, asking regulators to consider, and why can this not be implemented globally?
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you for the other members of the panel. So let me perhaps start with the beginning. So what is the WASB? So the WASB is the body tasked with developing the global slot guidelines. So it's newly created, as you mentioned. So our first meeting was in end of February or beginning of March, if I'm not wrong. And so the idea, in the beginning of 2021 was quite different in terms of our working plan than it is now, of course. So our idea was, of course, to talk about the reform of the worldwide airport slot guidelines. So everybody agreed, airports, airlines, and coordinators, that there is the need of an agenda for reform. But of course, that agenda now is on hold because the circumstances that we are facing are extraordinary, and we need to, first of all, to talk about them, to discuss them, and to solve the issues that we have today. We know that this is not the end game or the end objective for the board. The objective in the long term is, of course, to go back to its strategic agenda But nowadays, what we need to do, of course, is to discuss with the members and then to decide what to do in an unforeseen environment that is 2020 and 2021. So what we do at the board is that everybody, the 21 members, airport, airlines, and coordinators, we try to understand the points of view and we try to get to an agreement and conclusions. So the board has members from all the regions in the world with all different points of view, legacy carriers, low-cost carriers, big airports, small airports, coordinators with different perspectives and regulations. And we try to come up with guidelines that better express the needs of the industry. So what we are convening now is a recommendation to regulators that provides a globally compatible approach. That being said, the recommendation nonetheless recognizes that regulators should also look at national levels and national circumstances. For instance, markets are recovering faster than others, and that also needs to be taken into account. So, but the main importance of the board is that all decisions made by the board are heavily discussed by the members, not only the 21. So the airports have their own committee, the airlines the same, and then the coordinators likewise. So there are dozens of people involved, if not close to 100. And this is all negotiated, this is all discussed, and at the end, this is not the best outcome for airports, nor to the airlines, nor to the coordinators, but is the one that the industry feels comfortable to move ahead. And that's why we believe that the regulators should really implement the recommendations, because its pros and cons have been discussed. What can be the outcomes? What are perhaps the weak links or the weaknesses of the agreement? But at the end, we are all comfortable that this is the best agreement that we could achieve, and this is what is needed for aviation to recover in 2021.
Perfect, Joa. Thanks very much. And been an interesting year, I'm sure, as chairperson of WASB, and really that balanced approach the way forward. Ricky, moving on to you. You know, how will the relief package influence airline planning, and can you explain the need for decision making now?
Yeah.
Maybe another part, how will it support the recovery? And this is always a tough part. We always do these webinars. Can you give us a view on the industry prospects for 2020? What I guess your crystal ball would be saying at this stage.
Thank you so much. Well, let me start with, first of all, I think the key is, of course, understanding the airlines planning cycle we are in the current environment and how it influenced the airports, the destination, the entire supply chain, and the importance in us working together in really restarting the recovery. And then, of course, why a decision is needed now on the slot rules. If we start from the planning environment that airlines are in, then we have, during 2020 here, gotten used to completely new ways of forecasting, travel restrictions, the change of metrics, you know, cargo, particularly for long haul flights, importance of that, how we are converting from cargo to passenger flights, opening of corridors, which then close again. So we've gotten used to really agile adjusting, but very short-term focus. All airlines now are, of course, keen on and working on the recovery phase, which we hope is starting in some part in H1 2021. And I think the entire industry, airports, airlines, destinations are hoping for some kind of good Q3, where historically is the most profitable quarter for the industry. And we didn't have that one in 2020. So airlines are right now working on these recovery, plans and the startup plans. And that phase also has a lot of restrictions, you can say, a lot of things that airlines needs to have in their planning. For instance, activation of fleet and pilots. Some airlines have retired fleet. For Virgin Atlantic itself, we have retired our iconic 747s, and we need to now retrain those pilots to a different group. There is only a certain amount of simulators in the world, and it's every airline who's going to do the restart. So there's going to be other constraints as well that the airlines are doing behind the scenes in their planning. So getting the fleet and getting the pilots aligned with that, while we are in this situation that we don't know how recovery is going to be. We don't expect it to be equal between continents, between countries, even within countries, we don't know yet. So the slot rules we need now needs to, first of all, be global, and they shouldn't be for a specific business model or for one country. There needs to be flexibility for airlines to handle these uncertainties, both in the planning constraints and also in the uncertainties in the recovery. So, for example, a network carrier will be looking at how they can build back connectivity and bank structure. A lot of their business model is based on that the long-haul flights, for instance, have connectivity from short-haul flights. How they build back to that and the importance of that, where a low-cost carrier might want to have more agile network adjustments, want to change destination, want to do retimings. So really, the earlier we know the rules, the earlier the airlines can also start sharing the recovery scenarios and fine-tune them with the planning constraints with the airports, and of course also with the entire stakeholders and shareholders supply chain. This will give the airports and also the destination an ability to do their planning, which is also an interest for the airlines, because there's some airports that have terminals that's closed that needs to be reopened. There's the staffing at the security and at the airport in generally. And we all need this to be a successful restart and make sure that we are, when the passengers are there, we are able to deliver. So that's definitely key in us working as an industry together. Then how does and the proposal that we and adjust and match their capacity to demand. We have to remember that not all markets, not all routes will be back in 2021 on 2019 levels. So the serious return give an ability to kind of adjust that demand down. It also gives an ability for airlines to adjust the recovery plans with the planning constraint, while they can make sure that they can return to a market in 2022. Because it could be borders are closed, it could be recovery takes slower in certain areas, but it doesn't mean that airlines don't want to serve the market. And while they're not using those slots, it gives an ability and an opportunity for new entrants to make use of that, and at the same time also give them a kind of like an opportunity to get higher priority to return to that market in 2022. So I think also for the new entrants and for them to successfully to enter a market, it's really important that we know the rules soon, because they also need certain lead times, and coordinators needs to have a chance to kind of allocate the slots accordingly. So I think this is really the key why we believe this package from an airline planning and also we as an industry together can recover.
Perfect, Ricky. Thanks very much. Side note again, the scaling of our human capital and our talent in all sectors of the industry, airport, airline, air traffic control, security, government agencies, I think it is going to be a big challenge to make sure we're able to greet our customers coming back. So definitely the points about we're in this together are quite well taken. We're going to move on to beautiful Australia now. Petra, you know, what would happen in the case of a sudden changes to the health situation or travel restrictions? So we saw the initial pandemic start. We had sort of various measures around the world. We're hoping we're getting out of this, although cases are on the rise a little bit. But you know, what would happen in the case of sudden changes to health situation or travel restrictions from your point of view?
Thanks for your question. If a case of a sudden change of situations due to the pandemic, such as a new border closure that has happened, severely restricts the airline's ability to operate into an airport occurs, then the airlines are required to review the criteria that's set out in the justified non-utilisation of slots provided in the paper and see if any of these conditions meet their current issue. In this example, a border closure will qualify under 1.6.1 of the new JNUS. The airline can apply to the coordinator to have their slots alleviated for that period of the border closure. So the airlines can only have slots alleviated if they form part of a series. If, for example, there's a reduction in capacity due to health measures taken by a country or a state, then the airline can refer to the WASB best practice paper on capacity reductions and the JNUS provisions contained in that document. During this period of uncertainty, I would say that early communication is key, and I think Ricky pointed to that just before. Communication with your coordinator and your airport operator so that they're aware of any issues you might be having operating to an airport, whether it be new restrictions on crew, airport businesses like hotels, or new quarantine or isolation measures. So anything mentioned in that JNUS section of the Summer 20 Alleviation Recommendation. The earlier that the coordinators in the airport know, the better they can to assist to provide airlines with alternative options for operations, whether that be having to move a flight, swap with another airline, or open different facilities at the airport. I think during this time, coordinators need to stay agile as well, as we've seen, for example, in the Asia Pacific region, with borders opening up and then closing again, and travel bubbles planned and then cancelled. I think we can't predict the future of what's going to happen over the next few months and in 2021. We won't know what lies ahead, but therefore we have to be ready to act when events like border closures or government restrictions arise. And I think the Asia Pacific region has been has the toughest border closures in the world. And this has proven to be effective in controlling the virus, but has come at a really high cost, especially for our industry. As Anthony said previously, Hong Kong and Singapore are really good examples of solely international operations that are severely affected by the restrictions, by the government restrictions, and we see that in our airports too, in Manila, where we have a strong international side that's affected while the domestic's still operating. Now, not all regions and countries have the same experience with COVID measures, as been mentioned before, and therefore we need to be ready to acknowledge and act on new government measures in order to get to a point where we can start the recovery process. And lastly, I did want to say to my fellow coordinator colleagues that if you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask another coordinator. We're probably all sitting in the same boat right now and have similar questions ourselves. So don't be afraid and reach out to one of your coordinators and share your experiences or questions or issues with them. Thank you.
Thanks, Petra. And again, the sharing of knowledge, I think, is a critical factor. And so the beauty of this industry, even in tough times, that we are all there for each other. So thanks again for that input. So, you know, what this package, maybe I summarize, means in practical terms, if we look at passengers, it provides more reliable schedules and less last-minute cancellations. If we want to look at the airport point of view, from what we heard from definitely from Irene and from Joe, is also the availability of essential planning information, balancing sort of between protecting our pre-COVID banks and enable the new normal as airlines ready to pick up traffic and enter our airport on a long-term basis. Be good to start looking at long-term again. And then from airlines, I think it allows for certainty for planning sustainable operations, both from an environmental and economic aspects. So with that, I think we have some time for some questions. I'm just going to go into questions from the audience here. We're not going to have much time to get through all the questions, but I'm just going to look at one here. Okay, so this one, I think we'll start, Irene, I'll start with you, and maybe Didier could come in too on this one. A participant asked about what would happen if an airport must reduce its capacity during the season. So Irene, you maybe want to take that to start with, and then Didier could add.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, because that is one of the big questions that we're going to have to address as airports, because there may be various reasons why capacity must be reduced, whether it's for operational reasons, for the health and safety measures, for governmental restrictions, for commercial reasons. So there are many situations in which this could happen. And I think that the best thing is to rely on the best practice that was approved by the WASB some weeks ago, and which could be useful for airlines, airports and coordinators to have some guidance on how to proceed.
Thanks. Didier, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can only confirm what Irene just said. It's that we have a very good document for the recommendation for such cases. And of course, we must all together do our best to avoid being in such a situation, because the coordination of the Summer 21 is very much engaged already. We are already far in the process. So imagine if we would have to re-coordinate fully one or several airports. Luckily, I have only one airport in my portfolio, but I can imagine in Spain, speaking for Iran, it's more than 30 airports, if I remember well. If they have to re-coordinate even only 5 or 6 airports for the full summer 21, and the summer is a very busy season for Spain, it would be a nightmare, and as a consequence a nightmare also for the airlines, because they would have to re-coordinate both sides of the routes and things like that. So as far as possible, please avoid it, but of course sometimes you will be forced to do it because of health measures that are taken here and there. Yeah.
Perfect, thanks Didier, and I hope that answered the question from the participant. If not, just add an additional comment in the chat box. Going to another question here. Participant asked a question that not all airlines and airports support a waiver. What is the slot board position on that? Maybe Ricky, Joa, I don't know who wants to start on that one, or if you want to take it on.
I can start at least.
Okay.
So of course we have to remember the slot board. We look at this from a worldwide and as an industry together. So not a specific airline, not a specific airport, not just a specific area. It is kind of like the industry, both airlines, airports, coordinators, but also destinations together, where we're looking at, of course, how can we come up with a set of rules that can support different business models, different continents, and make sure that we are aligned on that. So we have a joint responsibility between us also to ensure a fair return to hopefully our normal business and coming back. A recovery is as soon as possible.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, Joe. Do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think we are absolutely aligned on this. But just to add that of course it is true. There are some people that they don't agree, but and we need to recognize that. But we need to also recognize that when each one of us go to their own groups and committees inside the airport community or airlines or coordinators, this was the majority. So at the end, we are representing a big portion of the industry worldwide, and this is a strong compromise. A strong compromise that everybody gave something that they wanted and that they are not achieving, but that's the basis of a negotiation and of a compromise, and so this is an industry-led compromise, and for me, and I think for us at the slot board, the most important is that this is our voice and this is our recommendation, and that we strongly recommend the regulators to follow, because this is the compromise of the majority of the airports, the majority of the airlines, and of course the majority of the coordinators.
Perfect, obrigado, Joao. Move on to, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, I'm being queued for one more question. So we have another question regarding this proposal and Europe. The question seems to be about the proposal by EC that is different from that of the industry. How would that impact the airlines and airports? What do people think? Maybe Irene, to start with you, and then maybe move it to Ricky, or I don't know what order, and Didier. Who would like to go first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Irene.
I think that Joao and Ricky just mentioned how hard it was to achieve consensus, and I think that's one of the best things that can be said about this agreement, which has been extremely difficult to achieve, and where all of the three stakeholders have tried to align their interests to obtain something in common, even though the situation is extremely hard for everyone. And I think that it's obvious that this is a recommendation and each regulator will have to decide the rules within their own region. But the aim is to, from our side, to get a global solution from both ends of the route, and that it aims to satisfy as much as possible the different positions that were at stake. Thank you.
Gracias, Irene. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I can add to it. I think, very good points. And I think from from an airline perspective, of course, it's not just Europe, and we would like a global solution. We have no aircraft that needs to fly outside Europe also, and the rules needs to match. The second thing is, of course, the full series return do give, particularly in the uncertain environment we're in right now, we really don't know how recovery is going to come back. It gives airlines that flexibility. On top of then you have a lower threshold. So it gives both that you can resize as you ramp up to all of the constraints we talked about, to all how we see it's coming, and at the same time you have flexibility to still do adjustments with the lower threshold. And I think both elements are really important, and it's not one or the other.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Ricky. Didier, would you want to add anything on that, or?
Yeah, I will limit myself to technical comments, of course, because I must have this attitude here, and we do not know exactly the details of what the European Commission is going to propose. We heard some elements that we get from here and there conversations. Obviously, they don't want to give any kind of LFE except the reduction of the threshold. Wow, we think that. For the sake of the best usage of the capacity and to help the industry or the capacity providers to be well prepared to offer the best services for the recovery, and also to give the airlines the time to requalify their pilots, to put their aircraft back in the fleets, because Ricky was saying earlier, they need time to have their pilots requalified eventually, but they need time also to unstore some of their aircraft from where they are, and I'm not sure that they will have enough capacity worldwide to make all the maintenances in one time. So we need some time. We need this kind of measures that are proposed by the WASB. We strongly support it because we find that it's well balanced, and it's ticking all the boxes of what the industry needs now to be able to restart operating. And we are limiting here to the operations only, and there are probably some other measures that some captains of industry already raised even earlier this week about other ways of doing things to support the industry on top of that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I think
go ahead.
sorry, I just want to add, as an airline that doesn't fly to Europe, I think in general, a lot of regulators and coordinators outside of Europe, they tend to look to Europe when they implement their own guidelines. But at the same time, I think we already mentioned that different regions recover at a different rate. So what if European Commission comes up with a set of policy that is different than the WASB guidelines, what we might see is that some countries in Asia would blindly adopt the same policy that European Commission sets out, that is designed for itself, but that doesn't necessarily fit the recovery rate of that particular region or country. So I think it would be far better if the world come together on one single policy.
Yeah, and if I may, Kevin, just to add on what Anthony said, I think that's the beauty or the usefulness of the board. So at the end, we are seeing this from the world perspective, and of course, who we are to say to the European Commission what they should do. We are just airports, airlines, and coordinators. But at the end, we live this industry, we breathe the industry, and we know the industry by heart. So this is our daily job. So when we do consensus, and the proposal is done in a way that you cannot just take pieces, because the proposal won't stand together, right? So you need to have it all, or the things won't work. So, and if I have a flight from São Paulo, let's say, to Frankfurt or Paris or Lisbon or Madrid, if the rules are different and very different from both sides of the route, what should we do? What airlines should do? And we need this in a flexible way, because not only for passengers, but for cargo, vaccines are coming. The logistics on vaccines is heavy, it's difficult. And you know, at the end, we need something that is, yes, there are local circumstances, there are markets that are growing faster than others, and that should be taken into account for sure. But at the end, the framework that we are working, the big pieces of it, the big deadlines, they should be the same, because this is the only way that the industry can continue to work as is as a global industry. And so I think this is a message from the board that for us is quite important. So, you know, don't pick and choose. And of course, then use the local differences in a way that you know, it's tangible, but does not change the overall framework that we have put together.
Perfect, Jorma. Thanks very much. Anybody else have anything to add? Because we're coming up right to the end of the webinar. I think we're good. Okay. And apologies if we didn't get to all the questions. We will attempt to answer them virtually afterwards. So I really think the discussion we had really shed light on the WASB recommendations and the aviation industry's global approach for the summer 2020. Clearly, the effort by all parties involved to reach an agreement was tremendous, but now it's when we need to work together most and really to come out of this crisis and get the industry back on its feet. My key takeaways would basically be from the conversations. WASB recommendation really aims to foster global compatibility and consistency by enabling a coordinated and gradual reinstatement of normal slot utilization rules. I think it provides a well-crafted balance between the safeguarding pre-COVID-19 networks and connecting banks enabling post-COVID-19 access opportunities and continuing to foster sort of a competitive industry that we want to have. It finally shows the leadership of the aviation industry in charting a global recovery approach. And I better understand why it's important for this, not just running the airport health accreditation, but from an industry point of view, that this is adopted swiftly by authorities responsible for coordinated airports. I think just before closing, so apologies keeping you a few minutes past, I'd really like to thank our panelists, some really good insights today from the airports, being Irene and Joa, from the airlines, Ricky and Anthony, and of course from the slot coordinators, Petra and Didier. On behalf of ACI World, IATA, and the WWACG, again, I'd like to thank you again for listening to the webinar. Wishing you a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, everybody.